and ES Next, and how when you put them together, it's heart, it's love, it's great. So jumping in real quick, here we go. So how many people here have developed in React before? Okay, good. React Meetup, that's what I was hoping for. So I'm kind of assuming that you've done some React. I'm going to show a lot of React code. I'm not going to actually explain how to develop in React, but even if you haven't developed in React, it's still JavaScript, so hopefully the things will be familiar in that way. But I am super excited about React. I'm totally drinking the Kool-Aid. I love JavaScript. I love the composability that we were just talking about, so super excited about that. The other half we're talking about is ES6 or ES Next, and I'll kind of describe what ES Next means moving forward. But who's actually done ES6 or ES Next? Okay, great. So a little bit less, but still some. So if you haven't done ES6, this will be a good kind of overview of the different functionalities that you can use. And if you've actually done it before, I'm hoping that there'll be a few things that you haven't seen before that you can start applying as well. But just a quick history on ECMAScript in general is that it's 21 years old. Brendan Eich developed it in 1995, way back then when he was in Netscape. And ES6 or ES 2015 was officially released last year in August. And ES7 or ES 2016 is going to be released next month. And basically, there's now this kind of yearly cadence that they're having. So any of the features that have gone to stage 4 of this 4-stage approval process will be in the next version of ECMAScript. So we can no longer call something ES7 functionality or ES8 functionality. It's just what stage is it in currently. And the cutoff is basically at the end of January of that year. So in January 28th, I believe, of this year, they kind of made the cutoff for what was going to be in ES6, or ES 2016 rather. So these are all the functionality that are in ES6 and ES 2015. There's this big, huge gap between ES5 and ES6, so they kind of threw a whole bunch of stuff, and the browsers and engines were quickly trying to catch up and figure out what exactly or how to implement all of these things. And they're finally getting to about 96, 97, 98% support. But then you contrast that with ES 2016, and there's two features in there. So there's includes method on arrays, which works kind of like string includes to see if a value's in there. And then the exponentiation operator, which is basically math.pow, just with 2 asterisks. So that's it, because that's all that made it, but there's more coming soon. So there's this GitHub account that lists all the things that are in their proposal stages, so I suggest you check that out if you're kind of interested in where your features are and what's the likelihood that it's going to be in the next version of ECMAScript. There are some that's sitting at stage 3, so it's a good chance they'll make it into the next one, but there are no guarantees with that. So I want to kind of set up what this talk is not about first. I guess I'll give the bad news. So like I said, it's not about why you should use React. Hopefully you're thoroughly convinced about React's awesomeness. That's why you're here. Also not how to develop React. And I fortunately only have 30 minutes, and this talk is probably really supposed to be a 45-minute talk. So I definitely don't have time to go into every detail, but it'll be a good overview. I won't talk about how to transpile or use Babel or Webpack or anything like that. But what this is about learning ES 2015 or ES6 and how we can apply it in React. When I go to talks, I like to see a lot of code, so when I give talks, I do the same. So there'll be a lot of code here, and then, like I said, it's going to be fast-paced because I'm trying to get through as much as I can in the time that I have. I'll be checking my watch. So just to introduce myself, like I said, I'm Ben Ilegbodu. I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father. This is my wife, Rashida, and our 2-year-old daughter, Simone. We're actually expecting another daughter. Target release date is September 1st. So that's like 3.5 sprints, so we're working through that. I work at Eventbrite, which is kind of not too far from here. I'm a senior UI engineer there, and I'm on our front-end architecture team. And we're actually also transitioning our JavaScript framework from jQuery and Backbone to React. And we've gone through a lot of the same things he was just sharing. So a lot of fun learnings that are coming out of that. And I'm also a huge sports fan. So Bleacher Report is awesome. I have the app and everything. I'm actually a LeBron fan more than I'm a Warriors fan. So anyway, I'm just going to go. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about these 12 things. I've divided them up into 2 sections. The first one being the features that you're more likely to use in React components directly, and the second one being more of the data APIs. So when you're actually calling functions from React, that's when you're more likely to use that piece of functionality. So, and then the last thing is that the way that I'm kind of going through this is transitioning the official React app that was written in ES5 and showing how you would rewrite it in ES6 and ES Next features. So this is that app, and I replaced my name with whatever was the default in the app. Okay, so components. So we have this huge big block of code here that you get. It's basically like the index.js, or they call it source.js or something like that. And it's all of the components written right there. So we have the comment component, comment list component, et cetera, and then we have our React DOM render at the bottom. And then we have all these assumed globals like React and React DOM and jQuery and such like that. So as we know, React is componentized and supposed to be modular, yet we have all of these things in one file. So how can we modularize this code? Well, there are ES6 modules that allow us to separate all of our files out. So now our comment.js file, we have explicit imports of our dependencies. So we import React, import Remarkable, and then we export default, our comment component that we just created. So now it's a module. Now we can use that in the comment list component, as you can see at the bottom of the second line, and import that. And then export default to comment list, so that when you get to the app, we're now importing the comment list as well as comment form, and because those are now defined in our app. And then finally at the bottom, the index.js. That's the only thing that needs to know about React DOM. That's the only thing that needs to actually know that we're rendering to the DOM, and that's where the React DOM render is. So if we wanted to do server-side rendering, for instance, we could still use our whole component tree, starting with app above, because nothing else knows about the DOM, and all of our dependencies are properly declared. So if you've done anything with React, this is old hat, right? Like, this is nothing new. I'm just kind of setting the stage, setting our overall structure so we can start talking about more specific features. So let's talk about react.createClass. So that's how you create your component in ES5. And it's fine. It's a class factory, basically. So it's a function that you call that will generate a class for you. And you specify your static prop types there, so that's a property, and then you have 3 other methods that it defines. But ES6 now introduces class syntax, so you can actually use the class keyword to define your class. So this is the overall structure of what an ES6 class looks like. You say class, the name of the class, and then you can extend whatever you want. In this case, it would be react.component, as we'll see in a second. There's a special method called the constructor method, which is constructor class, so you can do any construction type stuff. And then you can define static methods as well as normal instance methods as well. And the static methods obviously have the static keywords, so all kind of basic things. So when we transition our comment form class to using the class syntax, this is what it looks like. We have the constructor there that's initializing the state. Because the class syntax, if I can go back real quick, it allows you to define methods but has no definition for defining properties. So no static properties, no instance properties. So now when we're defining the state inside of the constructor, we have to do that right there. This.state equals that object. And then we have our handle submit form as well as our render method there. But then we have to define our static property for prop types outside of the definition of the class, because like I said, there are no static properties. But with one of the proposed functionality that's sitting in stage 1, you can actually define your static properties right inside of your class. So if you have Babel set up to, or Webpack set up to, actually Babel set up with Webpack to do that, then you can define your static properties within the context of the class and not have to do it outside. And similarly, that state property that was set inside the constructor, you can now also define it inside the context of the class. So now your component is one solid entity that's defining instance properties, static properties, instance methods, and potentially static methods if you had those as well. Okay? So, moving on, now that we have React.component and React.prop types, we can actually leverage something else that comes with modules and do named imports. So inside the React module, there's React, but then there's also React.component and React.prop types. So we can just pull those out immediately and start using them all throughout our code, so that now we're using a little, we don't have to do React dot throughout our code. We can just pull it out that way. And then similarly, we can immediately export default to class, because that's what our class, our module is doing. It's exporting the class. So just export default class all in one statement without having to do it later. But then we could take it a little bit further and pull out the initial state as a constant, because later on, when we reset our form, we're going to want to reset the state, because once we submit the form, rather, we're going to want to reset the state because we're now done. We want to make it blank so the next time they fill out the form field, everything is empty. And we don't want to duplicate our code. We want it to be dry. So we pull out the constant right there, initial state, and then set state right there to be that. But it's a variable. It's a var. It doesn't really look like a constant. I just made it capital letters so that it seems like one, but it's not really one. But now with ES6, we have something called block scoping that gives us a new let keyword as well as a new const keyword. And now I can just basically change that var to a const. And a variable that's declared const, you can't reassign it anymore. It works basically how you assume const would. And if you don't add a value, initial value, to a variable declared const, then it'll be an error as well. So both times it's error. And then we have our const there. But one thing to know about const is that it's the assignment or the binding that's constant, not the actual data. So I could actually go in and say initial state dot author and set it to something else after the fact, and nothing will complain because it's an object. So that's one thing to keep in mind with constants. So another problem that we've always had with JavaScript is this concept of variable hoisting. So here I want to prevent default when I submit, handle submit, and then start doing stuff with the variables. But what the compiler will do, the interpreter, the JavaScript engine will do, is actually move the declarations of var author and var text to the top of the function because of something called variable hoisting. And I don't have time to explain what that is. If you don't know, there's a link right there. And I'll send a link out to my slides, or post a link out to my slides. So you can click these links and all the other links that are in here. So we typically, with ESLint rules, enforced by ESLint rules, say that all variables, var declarations, should be at the top of the function so that you make sure that you're not susceptible to variable hoisting. Because 95% of the time, it's okay, but those 5% of the time, you're pulling your hair out. Even I'm pulling my hair out sometimes. So now, with block scoping, we have let. And let is not susceptible to variable hoisting. Wherever you declare the variable, that's where you declare the variable. So you can't actually have access to the variable beforehand. It'll be an error, which is something very simple. It's like JavaScript finally catching up to the rest of programming languages, essentially. So one thing that I want to kind of call out is that there's this trend in JavaScript, I don't know where it came from, but this mentality of using const everywhere. Like, unless you're going to reassign the variable, use const, and then if you are, then you use let in these small cases. And this is a personal rant, so it's my opinion, but I hate it. Like, it completely dilutes the meaning of const, in my opinion. For me, a const is something that is going to never change across the entire execution of the code, whereas in this case, we're assigning the state variable that we know is going to change all the time to a const inside a local variable of a function. Like, that is just not const in my mind. But that's just my opinion. So, and I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm telling you not to do it. Okay? Just don't do it. So let's fix the code. Let's go back to using let, as you should. One other thing I want to point out that jumps out to me really quickly is the fact that we have some duplication here on that second and third line. Basically, we're assigning author and text, pulling it out of state, and it's very similar, I guess, in what we're doing in those declarations. So there's a way with the new syntax called destructuring that we can change those two lines and combine them into one. And destructuring is kind of like the weirdest syntax, I would say, with JavaScript, and I feel like you're going to feel this way to me if you've never seen it before. But as you see it more and more and get more comfortable with it, I think it'll actually be your favorite feature of ES6. It's become my favorite feature, and you'll actually love me as much as I love React. Okay? That's what I'm looking for. So what we've done is we've changed, let's see, no, that doesn't work. We've changed those two statements into one. And we've combined them using this object literal pattern that's on the left-hand side. Not the right-hand side, but the left-hand side. And that's called the destructor pattern. In this case, it's an object destructor pattern. And I'll kind of show them side by side, the before and after. We had these two lines, and now that's similar to these two lines. So what this is saying is that inside the state object, take out the property author, and then create a variable with the same name and assign it its value. And do the same thing for text. That's what that line is saying. And you can actually rename. So down here, we're still pulling out of state author and text, but we're actually going to create a variable named author name and assign this.state.author to that variable and do the same thing for full text. So if you didn't like the name of the property that was in the object and you want to have a different name for your variable, you can actually do renaming with object destructuring. And the order of how you put it doesn't matter at all. You can reverse those and it's perfectly fine. But it even gets a little bit cooler in my opinion. You can simulate name parameters by doing object destructuring in the function header. So what we have here is what's called a stateless function in React. And normally, you're always passed the props to the stateless function, as you can see here, and then you can use those props in your JSX. But in this case, we could just immediately destructure the style and content with the same object literal pattern in the header. So now we just have style and content variables. We never actually have a props variable anymore. It just immediately becomes those variables, which I find really convenient, and I use this kind of syntax all the time, because that's essentially the content, the data that you want to deal with. So that's name parameters and object destructuring. There's also array destructuring, which I use a little bit less. There's a whole bunch of code on here. I really want to show that third example right there, where we have a regular expression match. And when you do groups and regular expressions, as you know, you get back an array of all of the groups when you do the match. And for some reason, the first element in that match is the entire match, or the entire string. Never understood why that is, but that is the way that it is. But now with array destructuring, you can actually skip that by just putting a comma, and there's no variable there. And then now, month, or the MO variable, is the second element, and then day and year. And you immediately get those out instead of having to do some kind of matches variable and then do matches 1, matches 2, and assign those variables. So you immediately get that and not have to deal with that kind of intermediary array. And you can also do array destructuring inside a function header as well. But you can actually take object destructuring, take array destructuring, and nest them together and put it all together. And I don't want you necessarily to pay attention to what this code is specifically doing. I just want to highlight that just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do something. Okay? there is a line that should be drawn, and I'm thinking I'm drawing it around here. But I have written code like this, so you know, that's what that's worth. Okay. Completely different problem. Can anybody spot the bug in this code? Any takers? What you got?
This will be undefined because it's inside the function instead of an arrow function.
That's exactly right. This is undefined. And if you don't know why this is undefined, go to that link on MDN and it explains all that about scoping and all that stuff. Don't have time to talk about why that is, but it's annoying, right? It's like if you're a new JavaScript developer, you have no idea why this is undefined. Like, this should be that. Like, I don't know, it's this. And if you're a seasoned developer, you still come into this, you still run into this problem sometimes, and once again, you're pulling your hair out. But it's kind of annoying. And the fix in ES3 was to declare a variable called self, or m, or that. I've heard some new millennials call it selfie sometimes, which is interesting. But you basically store a variable so that you have it in scope inside of the function. But then with ES5, and the example that's in the React tutorial, you can use bind, and you can pass the this context in that should be used, the this that should be inside the this. It's confusing to talk about. But now with ES6, we have something called arrow functions. And arrow functions pass, they have the this that you would expect. It just works how you would expect. It uses something called lexical scoping, that's the technical term. But basically it just works. And on top of that, we get a kind of shortened, more succinct syntax. So we can get rid of the function keyword, and that's typically how I write our stateless functions, using arrow functions everywhere. I try to use them. No more function keyword for me. Okay, so back in the comment form, looking at handle submit, tackling another problem. So we've already got the destructuring figured out over there. We're using let, so no more variable hoisting. Now I want to jump down to this.props.on comment submit. You've got some more duplication going on right there with author, :author, and text, :text. And there's something called enhanced object literals to solve that code. Basically, you just write less code than before. And using object literal shorthand, we basically can omit the values or omit the keys, whichever way you want to think about it. But essentially, instead of doing author, :author, you just have author, because the variable name and the key name are the exact same. So now you can kind of shorten that way. So now I'm always trying to make use of object literal shorthand, so I'm always trying to name my variables the same as the object keys so I can then not have to write it. I do more work figuring out how to change the variable names so I can write less code. It's interesting, but it's fun. I enjoy it. So that's kind of what you can do with object literal shorthand. So that's one feature of the enhanced objects literals. Another feature is showcased with this example here. So if you have an object and you want to set a key that is a variable as your key, you can't do that in the normal object definition. At least you couldn't until what I'm about to show you in a second. This is the way you have to do it right here. You have to do multiple lines in order to assign it using the bracket notation. But now, with object literal computed keys, you can declare it all in line right there. So you define your object literal, your variable is called name, and you put that in brackets. and then you can have your value be whatever you want. So you no longer have to do these multiple statements right there. And that's object literal computed keys. Okay, so hitting the home stretch here. So here we have a function called join, and join works a lot like the join method on arrays, except that it takes a string that you want to be your separator and then an arbitrary number of strings after it. But if you look at the join method, you wouldn't know that it does that. You just think it just takes the separator and that's it. But looking at the content of the code, and if you're familiar with JavaScript, the arguments keyword there is kind of a flag that it's expecting to do something with an arbitrary list of arguments. And since you have that separator and you don't want that included in your joined characters, we start at 1 and then iterate over and push all these values into a values array, because you can't call it .join on arguments because it's array-like, not a real array. JavaScript. But this is now solved with something called the REST operator. So the REST operator is 3 dots before a parameter and a function, and all of the parameters at the end basically get coalesced into an array. So if you only pass one parameter argument to join, then values in this case would be an empty array. But in this case, since you pass tic-tac-toe, values now has those 3 elements in it, and you can call it .join on it. Easy peasy, and now you just have the ability to have REST parameters, basically, which is super cool and super useful. So this is actually not, we haven't seen any React code yet with this, but we're working our way towards an example. I just want to kind of set the stage about what REST parameters are. So you can combine array destructuring that we saw before with the REST operator, so now you can pull out values out of an array really quickly and have the rest of them. So this kind of is a quick way to, or trick, I guess, basically, to replace the need for using slice. And we're pulling out the first element into the first array, and then taking the rest into the rest array, which is similar to doing slice there. Okay, now we're getting to React here. A proposal that's in stage 2 is not doing REST with arrays, but doing REST with objects, so REST properties. So when you have this.props, and you know some of the props that you want to pull out, but then the rest you just kind of want them into a new object, you can use the same REST operator here and pull that now into this variable called input props there. And input props will have everything less than that. So it's kind of similar to doing like underscore, low dash, omit, basically, if you're familiar with that. It's just kind of similar, but now it's in JavaScript instead of having to do a library, having to use a library. Okay. Whew. So that was all the component stuff. Now data APIs. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So here we have math.max. And if you're familiar with math.max, it takes 3 parameters, or not 3, it takes an arbitrary number of parameters that you can pass. But if you had an array and you want to get the max of those, you'd have to use math.max.apply and pass a null context, and then the second value is the array. And it's kind of weird, you have to really know JavaScript to be able to know why this even works. And it's just kind of convoluted. But now we have the spread operator in JavaScript to kind of solve this type of problem. The spread operator is 3 dots yet again, but it's 3 dots in a function call this time. And it does the flip of what the REST operator does. It takes an array and spreads it out into parameters of a function call. So it's as if you called math.max with 33, 2, 9 in your array. So it allows you to go from arrays to parameters easily just by doing ... So just to be clear, spread operator takes an array and turns it into multiple parameters, and you use it in a function call typically. And the REST operator takes multiple parameters and brings them together in an array, and is usually in a function header.
What's the comparable of this being a good idea in another language?
what is, so if you've ever used like, I think it's called quargs in Python, or those kind of things, it's kind of a similar to that. I'm trying to think of other languages that use it.
Splat.
Pretty sure. Splat and Ruby? Okay, I've never used Ruby, but yeah, I've heard of Splat before. So other languages do have this, and it's kind of JavaScript kind of finding its own syntactic sugar for simulating or making those similar things. Okay, but the spread operator does more than just what I said. It also allows for supporting immutability. So here we have an array, scale from literal, that we're creating from other arrays without having to do any mutations. We're just creating this array literal, spreading in start. So when we spread in start, it's as if we put do, re, mi inside that array literal. And then fa and so, and then spreading in end. So it's kind of equivalent of doing concat, like you can see there at the bottom, but doing it all in one array without having to have any subarrays that you would get from concat. So this comes in handy in data, in React specifically with objects. So there's the same stage 2 proposal allows you to create an object and create a new object with an object literal without having to use object.assign or no-assign as well. So as you can see here, I have this object that has the Warriors' 3 best players and their fictional NBA 2K ratings. And now they're adding Kevin Durant that we just signed, or you just signed, I guess. And now the new Warriors has that object literal there with the new one in there. Without actually mutating the original array, we're creating a new object, taking everything that was in Warriors, adding it there, and then adding Kevin there. Okay, and then there's also JSX spread attributes, which is not related to the object spread that I said before, but it's similar. It's part of the transpiling that happens with JSX that allows you to essentially take that object that we had, an object, and convert it into multiple attributes in a JSX tag. So you don't have to actually explicitly put every tag, every attribute, it'll do it for you. Okay, so I knew I was running out of time. I knew I was going to be running out of time here. I wish I could have talked to you about the fetch API and promises. I wish I could have talked to you about default parameters. I wish I could talk to you about the string API and the new things that were coming there, as well as the array API and things that were coming there, but I didn't. I ran out, going to be running out of time. So that was the recap of what we talked about. I do want to shout out really quickly, I created a GitHub repo on my GitHub called react.js next, where I go through each one of those steps and actually have folders for each step to see how I went from one stage to the next and how you can apply all of these different functionalities. So if any of them stood out to you and you want to see how you can actually write an actual app with it, there's an example there. And then I have additional resources here. A blog that I wrote about ES6 and Eventbrite's React Coding Style Guide. So to close, I just wanted to give some shout outs. Wanted to give shout out to Bleacher Report for hosting us here and having an awesome venue. The Team Stream app was the first one to tell me that Draymond Green got arrested for slapping someone in Michigan, so kudos to you guys for that quick fingers. I want to shout out Devin for inviting me here to speak and for hosting this meetup. I think in general we kind of take for granted the meetups that we have here in the Bay Area and the fact that we have food and have great speakers to share with us. And it's really a labor of love for her. I don't know exactly why she got into it, but it's awesome for all of us. So I just wanted to take time to celebrate Devin and give her a hand for I wanted to shout out Eventbrite, who actually connected me with her, so that's why I'm here. And yes, of course, we're hiring, just like everybody else. And then lastly, I want to thank you guys for listening to me talk. Thank you very much, guys.
Do you guys have questions for Ben? That was a lot of dense material. No questions. You guys should follow Ben on Twitter, and I'll send out all of these links and his slides and stuff.
It got cut off right here. The link was actually right there, unfortunately.
But, okay. I'll send it out. I'll send it out for everyone, and then we can all maybe talk about it, like friendly style.
If you have any questions afterwards, I'll be here. We can totally chat about it. Oh, you have one question?
Yeah. So I guess both the presentations kind of covered UI and stuff with React. And, I was wondering what you guys thought and what you guys do about styles. So like CSS, and how does that fit into the whole modular architecture that we're pushing for with React?
Yeah.
There's some things on the horizon that people disagree with, and I'm wondering what your opinion is on that.
Right. Yeah. So there's, I think there's kind of 4 ways you can deal with styling. So there's something called, or there's the movement of putting your CSS in React, right? So that's just your styles in line. There's something called CSS modules, which kind of hooks up your modular CSS with React kind of automatically and namespaces your class. Then you can just create your own CSS snippets and import them directly with React. And then the last one is you just have your global CSS and stuff works somehow. So we do the second class where we write our own modular CSS. We name it a certain way, and then we import it inside of our React components, and we name our classes with BIM styling so we know that there won't be any kind of collisions that way. The reason I really want to push for inline CSS or inline styling, but because of media queries and because of pseudo selectors, that's kind of the main reason I haven't made that push. But because it kind of solves all of the specificity wars that you have to deal with. But we just go with that approach.
And just FYI, I shared a video like 2 days ago from last meetup, and it's on our React meetup channel. That was just 100% dead. It was 30 minutes of this guy talking about nothing but that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Ben? Round of applause.